There is a kind of anxiety that has nothing to do with danger. No threat is present, nothing is broken, no one has been hurt. And yet the feeling is there, low, persistent, humming underneath everything like a machine that never turns off. It lives in the space between where you are and where things might go, between what you've planned and what you can't guarantee, between the life you're building and the 10,000 ways it might not hold together. Most people call this worry, but it isn't quite worry. Worry has an object. This is something older than that, quieter. It sits with you in the morning before anything has happened. It rides with you through ordinary days. It waits. You aren't afraid of something specific. You're afraid of not knowing. And what no one tells you, what you have to find out for yourself, slowly through experience, is that the not knowing isn't the problem. It's what you do with it that changes everything. He was 34 years old and had done most things right. Not perfectly, but carefully. He had built something, a career that took years to stabilize, an apartment that finally felt like his, a relationship he had worked at, habits he had formed and maintained, a version of his life that from the outside looked like someone who had figured things out. But inside, in the quiet places, there was something else. It started small. A reorganization at work. Nothing confirmed, just whispers in hallways, and a meeting that got scheduled then postponed. His manager had been vague in a way that didn't feel accidental. He told himself it was nothing. He made his lists. He followed his routines. He showed up early. But at night he would lie awake and run the scenarios. What if the position was eliminated? What if he had to start over? What if the savings weren't enough? What if this was the moment when the careful scaffolding of his life, all of it, began to come apart? He wasn't spiraling. He wasn't falling. He was functioning, fully on the surface. He answered emails. He made dinner. He was present in conversations. But underneath, he was bracing. He had been bracing for months. What made it harder was that there was nothing to act on. That was the particular cruelty of it. If something had actually gone wrong, he would have known what to do. He was good at responding. He was good at problem solving, at adapting, at making a plan and executing it. Action, he could handle. It was the waiting that undid him, the suspended space between knowing something might change and knowing what it would change into. So instead of acting, he planned. He ran numbers in his head before bed. He researched job markets he wasn't even sure he needed to research. He rehearsed conversations that hadn't happened and might never happen. He built spreadsheets on weekends, savings projections, expense cuts, alternative timelines, not because anyone had told him to, but because it felt like doing something. Because the act of planning gave him the temporary illusion that the ground beneath him was still solid. It wasn't enough. Every plan he made felt like standing on a floor he wasn't sure would hold. The more he thought through the possibilities, the more possibilities appeared. The future kept expanding the more he looked at it, branching, multiplying, filling every quiet hour with new versions of what might go wrong. He started noticing it in small ways. He would be in a conversation and realize he had been somewhere else entirely. Sitting at the table with his partner, food in front of him, present in body but already 3 months ahead, already in the version where everything had changed. He would catch himself mid-sentence and lose the thread of what he'd been saying, not because something had distracted him, because he was somewhere hypothetical, working on a problem that hadn't arrived. Sleep had changed too, not dramatically. He wasn't lying awake every night, but there was a different quality to it, a shallowness. Like part of his mind was staying slightly on guard, even in the hours when there was nothing to guard against. He mentioned it to his partner one evening lightly, the way you mention something when you're not ready to admit how much it's been weighing on you. They were doing the dishes, not really looking at each other, and he said something about work being uncertain, about not knowing what the next few months would look like. She turned off the water and turned toward him. She asked what he was most afraid of. He stood there for a moment. The question was simple. It should have had a simple answer. He opened his mouth and nothing came out with any clarity. "I don't know," he finally said. That's the problem. That was honest. But it was also the first time he had actually named it. Not the fear of a specific outcome, but the fear of not knowing which outcome was coming. Of standing at a fork with no way to see where either path led. Of having no control over which version of the future would eventually arrive and ask something of him. She didn't try to fix it. She didn't offer a solution or a reframe. She just nodded and said she understood, and they finished the dishes without saying much else. He went back to his routines the next morning. He kept functioning. but something about saying it out loud had made it slightly more visible, and also, strangely, slightly more separate from him. Like he'd set it down on the table for a moment and seen it from the outside. The anxiety was still there. It didn't leave because he'd named it. But for a brief moment it had looked like a thing he was holding, rather than a thing he was made of. He wasn't sure what to do with that yet. One afternoon, unremarkable, midweek, the kind of day that leaves no impression, he was at his desk and he stopped. Not because something happened. Nothing happened. It was ordinary. The hum of the office, the sound of someone's keyboard across the room, a phone ringing 2 desks over and stopping. Afternoon light through the window hitting the wall at an angle he had seen 100 times without really seeing it. He had been in the middle of drafting another contingency plan, mapping out what he would do if the restructure went one way, then another, then a third, when something arrived. Not a thought exactly, more like a feeling that appeared before the words did. He had been living inside the future for months. Every morning he woke up and walked directly into a version of tomorrow. Not this moment, not this room, not the actual concrete life in front of him, but something further ahead, something uncertain and threatening and not yet real. And all the energy he had spent preparing, planning, rehearsing, it had all been spent in that imaginary space, for a future that hadn't arrived. That might not arrive the way he was imagining it at all. He sat with that for a minute. Longer, maybe. The anxiety wasn't about tomorrow. The anxiety was happening right now. He was living inside it today, in a present moment that hadn't broken yet, might not break at all, and he was spending it in a place that didn't exist yet, bracing for a collapse that lived entirely in his projections. He looked at the screen, at the spreadsheet, at the branching timelines he had built. Then he looked at what was actually in front of him, the room, the light, the real work on his desk, the immediate, available work he had been half ignoring for weeks because some part of him had decided that managing the hypothetical future was more urgent than living in the actual present. He thought about what he could actually do. Not theoretically, right now, with what he had. He could update his portfolio, something he'd been putting off for 2 years. He could ask his manager for a direct conversation instead of waiting for one to be offered. He could put something extra aside this month. He could begin learning one thing he had been meaning to learn. Not because any of those actions would guarantee anything. They wouldn't, but they were real. They were available. And unlike the contingency plans he kept building in his head, they could actually be done. He didn't transform that afternoon. He went home, made dinner, watched something with his partner. He slept about the same as usual, but something had shifted in its orientation. Not resolved, not quieted. Just turned slightly, like a compass needle that had been spinning and found for a moment, something to point toward. There's a thinker who spent his life studying what happens when the ground gives way, not a philosopher who wrote from comfort or distance. A man who had held real power, lost it completely, been imprisoned and exiled, and who spent the rest of his life in a farmhouse outside Florence, trying to understand what human beings could actually do in a world that offered no guarantees. Machiavelli. He is remembered, usually for the wrong things, for cynicism, for the calculated use of power. But what his writing returns to, again and again, what he seems to have been working through across his entire body of work, is a simpler and harder question than politics. What can a person actually control? He had a word for the force that operates beyond us. Fortuna, not luck. Exactly. Something larger. The tide of circumstance. History, chance, the decisions of people with more power than you, the timing of things no one chose. All of it gathered under one word. His conclusion about Fortuna wasn't comforting in the conventional sense. He didn't say it could be mastered. He didn't offer a method for eliminating uncertainty. What he said was that roughly half of what happens to us is beyond reach, and the other half, the half that belongs to us, is determined entirely by what we choose to do with it. He used the image of a river. When a great river floods, it overwhelms everything. There is no point standing in the current arguing with it. But a person who spent the dry season building channels, reinforcing banks, preparing the terrain, that person suffers differently when the water rises. Not because they stopped the flood, because they were ready for it. He called the capacity to do that kind of work virtù, not virtue in the moral sense. Something closer to active readiness, the developed ability to read a situation clearly, to act when action was possible, and to hold steady when it wasn't. The man at his desk was not lacking virtù. He was misapplying it. He was spending it on the flood itself, trying to predict every path the water might take, trying to outthink an event that had not yet arrived. And meanwhile, the dry season, the actual time when preparation was possible, was passing in a state of suspended dread. He had confused managing the future with building himself for it. Those are not the same thing. Most of us do some version of what he was doing, not because we're weak or irrational, because this is what the mind does when it cares about something and is afraid of losing it. It reaches forward, it tries to get there first, it runs scenarios and rehearses outcomes, not because the rehearsing actually helps, but because the act of rehearsing feels like control, and control feels like safety. The belief underneath it is almost never spoken out loud. It doesn't need to be. It operates quietly, that if we think hard enough about what might go wrong, we can keep it from going wrong. That worry is a form of preparation. That anxiety, if sustained and thorough enough, functions as a kind of shield. It doesn't. What Machiavelli kept returning to, in different forms, across decades of writing, is that the river will rise regardless of how long you stare at it. The question is not whether you can prevent the flood. The question is what you've done with the time before it arrives. There is a specific kind of suffering that belongs to people who live primarily in the future. Not dramatic suffering, not collapse, not crisis. Quiet suffering. The kind that runs in the background of ordinary days. It shows up as a slight absence in conversations. A tiredness that sleep doesn't fix. A persistent feeling of being somewhere slightly adjacent to your own life. Present, but not quite here. You are functioning, but you are also somewhere else. Somewhere ahead, where things might go wrong, doing the exhausting work of trying to prevent a collapse that may never come. And the part that's hardest to accept, it doesn't protect you. The anxiety doesn't change what's coming. It only changes how you experience the time before it arrives, taking the days that are still intact and filling them with the weight of futures that aren't real yet. You suffer the outcome twice. Once in imagination, and once, maybe, in reality. There's also something else happening underneath the planning, something that rarely gets named. The anxiety starts to feel like loyalty. Like if you stopped worrying, you would somehow be letting your guard down. As though the worry itself is doing something useful, keeping you prepared, keeping you vigilant, keeping you from being caught off guard, so you keep it running. Not because it helps, because stopping it feels irresponsible. But vigilance without an object is just exhaustion. And exhaustion, sustained long enough, starts to reshape how you see everything, including the parts of your life that haven't changed at all. Machiavelli understood something that is easy to grasp in theory and very difficult to actually live. That uncertainty is not a problem with the situation. It is the natural condition of human life. The ground was always going to be like this. The future was always going to be open. The question was never how to close it down. The question is how to move inside it. There's a difference between preparing and controlling. It sounds small. It isn't. Preparing means you work with what's actually in front of you. You look at the real terrain, not the imagined one, not the worst-case projection, the actual present terrain of your life. And you build things that are genuinely buildable. You strengthen what's within reach. You make choices in the present that increase your capacity to respond when the future arrives and asks something of you. Controlling means you try to shrink the unknown until it feels manageable. You account for every version of what might happen. You run enough scenarios that the future starts to feel less open. And when that doesn't work, when the future remains stubbornly open, as it always does, you run more. One of those is possible. The other is an attempt to do something the mind cannot do. The anxiety, the low, grinding, background kind, tends to live almost entirely in the second, not in the preparing, in the controlling, in the attempt to close down what will not be closed. What shifts it, slowly, is not certainty. Certainty doesn't come. What shifts it is something quieter, the gradual recognition that your actual job is not to know what's coming. Your actual job is to be someone who can meet what comes, and that person is built here, in the present, through the small and unglamorous acts of doing what's actually available. That's not a resolution. It's more like an orientation, a way of standing inside your own life that leaves room for what you don't know, without being consumed by it. There's something Machiavelli's writing keeps implying, never quite stating directly, but always circling, which is that the person who survives uncertainty well is not the one who predicted it. It's the one who remained capable of responding to it, who didn't spend their dry season so deep in the flood scenarios that they neglected to build anything. That's a subtle distinction. But it's the one that changes everything. Less bracing, more presence, more trust. Not in the outcome, but in your own readiness to respond. The river is going to do what it does. Machiavelli never pretended otherwise. But what you build in the dry season, what you do with the time before the water rises, that's yours. That always was. Anxiety about the future isn't always fear. Sometimes it's the mind's way of trying to carry something that was never meant to be carried alone. You don't have to resolve the uncertainty to be okay inside of it. The future is open. That's not a flaw in the design. That's just what the future is. A space where things are still becoming. And you exist in it, not as someone watching from a distance, but as someone whose attention, choices, and actions are already part of what comes next. Not all of it. Not even most of it. But the part that's yours, that part is real, and it's available right now. There is something to do today, not to guarantee the outcome you want, but because it builds the kind of person who can meet whatever comes, who has the readiness, not just the plans. Machiavelli didn't promise calm waters. He just pointed to what a person could do, steadily, honestly, without illusion, while the waters were still rising. That's where this ends. Not with an answer, with a direction.